Welcome, everyone, back to Bible study here at Concordia St. Paul for our fifth session in our series, Following to the Cross, Mark chapters 11 through 16. My name is Dr. Jeff Kloa. I'm pleased to be joining you as a guest teacher for these weeks as we walk carefully, in really close detail, through the text of the Gospel according to Mark and see what it tells us about Jesus, about what he's come to do, and what it means to follow him. And today we have, I hate to say, kind of a challenging section actually in Mark chapter 13. It's challenging because there's one main point through the entire section of over 40 verses. So there's going to be a lot of kind of going through things until we get to, you might say, a payoff at the end. It's also challenging because it deals with, well, historical past, present, and future events, and especially around interpretations having to do with the last day or the end times. And so the way this passage has been understood and interpreted and kind of read on a surface level has not always been, I would say, entirely accurate or helpful. So I'm going to give you kind of a bit of an overview of the chapter, a little bit of background on prophecy and the way that functions in the Old Testament and how Jesus carries that out here in Mark chapter 13. And then, as we'll see at the end, what the point of this section is. Now, if you've been generously tracking through this Bible study for these weeks, it won't surprise you when I say that we're not going to cover the entire chapter 13 of Mark today. This is an incredibly complex chapter, and talking about big biblical prophecy and the end times can be really confusing and a lot of really unhelpful teaching about that. So today, I want to give you some background on what prophecy is and how that functioned in the Old Testament, how it's functioning in Jesus as the ultimate final prophet, and how that will help us understand how not only prophecy works, which is important in and of itself, but also how prophecy is fulfilled, and in this case, has already been fulfilled in what Jesus says in Mark chapter 13, but also what is yet to come and how we should respond to these prophetic words of Jesus, how we should be ready for that last day. So, uh, thanks for sitting through this session, but really interesting stuff to talk about prophecy and the end times. And I want to make sure that we get a good foundation so we can understand Jesus' words properly. Now, if you haven't yet gotten used to the way I do this, just kind of what I do, I would encourage you to pause now and just read Mark chapter 13. Just sit down and read through it so you have in your head the entirety of the text and some of the questions that you might have as we walk through it. Unfortunately, I won't be able to address everything today. Um, I don't think I'm going to get to 50 minutes today. We'll see how kind of it ends up. But a couple of overview points before we get started. This chapter 13, if you'll notice, is kind of right in the middle of that section of 11 to 16. We've had two chapters of Jesus from Palm Sunday through the widow's mite, putting the offering in the temple offering box. And now we're still in chapter 13 on Tuesday. He's left the temple Tuesday of Holy Week, and he's with his disciples. In fact, he's still in the temple when we start chapter 13. And then after chapter 13, we get two chapters of the Passion story, beginning with the last Thursday, Maundy Thursday, and then on through Good Friday, and in chapter 16 then with Easter. So this is kind of smack dab in the middle of this important section, and I think there's a reason for that. And again, it has to do with a main theme of the Gospel of Mark, as I've mentioned numerous times throughout this study. A key question or a key reminder for us is when Jesus says something is going to happen, what happens? Well, that's a critical point that's being made in Mark chapter 13. So let's move into it. Now, we'll start with this view that I've shown you before, looking down from the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley at the Temple Mount platform. And of course, this is modern day Jerusalem with the Dome of the Rock there, where Herod's temple would have stood in the first century, in modern Jerusalem behind it. But this is the spot where Jesus is sitting with his disciples through chapter 14 as he goes through this section. And we see this yellow arrow going across the screen. Those stones are the large stones which Jesus is referring to in chapter 13 and which would have been there in the first century. Now, the temple, as we'll see, was destroyed about 40 years after Jesus' lifetime. But that's the view. That's what Jesus is looking at. And again, as a refresher, this is a reconstructed model of Herod's temple, probably a little higher perspective than you'd get from the Mount of Olives with this photo. But that's what Jesus is looking at and his disciples in chapter 13. And that's what they're marveling at as we go through the first few verses of chapter 13. So, what's the question that gets addressed? Again, Jesus and his disciples are on Tuesday of Holy Week. He has just given them the teaching about the widow and how she gave her entire life. She did exactly the right thing, unlike everyone else that seemed to be associated with the temple at the time. But then, as they're walking out the door, the disciples comment on the temple. And again, you got to kind of love the disciples. And keep in mind, these guys are all, they're from Galilee. They, at least in the Gospel of Mark, have not yet been to Jerusalem. So they're going to the big city for the first time. I always hesitate to use a comparison because I'll offend somebody. But let me think of an example. I just won't. And it's your classic country kid, never been to the big city, and they show up and there's, the Empire State Building. There's these gigantic buildings that they've never seen before. And of course, it's going to be remarkable. Of course, they're going to be amazed. And you get this in 13. As he came out of the temple, notice he's coming out. One of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." Right? It's like, can we get a postcard and send it back to mom and pa up in Galilee, right? Jesus said to him, verse 2, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So, kind of dampens the enthusiasm for the postcard at that point, right? These amazing buildings, which don't exist anywhere else. The temple is unique within that region of Judea, Galilee, the entire area. This disciple is thinking, wow, this is pretty cool. And Jesus says, enigmatically, strangely, not one stone upon another will be left here that will not be thrown down. And he's standing literally amongst those stones. So the focus is on those very bricks, wonderful stones, wonderful buildings, here, stone, spot, right? Jesus is remarking, is commenting on what will happen with the very stones that they are looking at that very moment, sometime around 30 AD in the ancient city of Jerusalem. So when they get back across the Kidron Valley and back up the Mount of Olives on the way back to Bethany, which is where they've been staying, they take a little break. They sit down, they're, having a picnic, who knows what they're doing, and they're looking back over the city of Jerusalem. And those words of Jesus obviously left an impression on the disciples. So, verse 3 of chapter 13, as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, right, looking at the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, not even with the rest of the disciples, but just these four who again and again and again are the kind of inner circle during Jesus' ministry. And they ask him the question, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Now, these disciples are starting to get a clue here, right? Because as we pointed out, whenever Jesus says something is going to happen, what happens? Well, it happens, right? He says that you're going to find a donkey and somebody's going to ask you some questions, and here's what you're going to answer, and they're going to let you take the donkey. And guess what? It happens. He says the fig tree is not going to bear fruit ever again, and guess what? It happens. So now he says these great stones will be thrown down, not one left on another. And they finally figured out that it's probably going to happen. And how long did it take the fig tree to wither and die? It took a day, literally 24 hours. And, and now the disciples are a little worried. This whole Jerusalem thing, uh, Jesus, when we come back tomorrow, are these stones going to be gone? I mean, it's actually, they're kind of figuring this out, right? When will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? That is, they're learning when Jesus says something is going to happen, what happens? And what always happens is Jesus' word is fulfilled. It is accomplished. So they're nervous because he's talking about the stones of the temple, this great temple that had been built by Herod. So I want to take a little break here and talk about the function and role of a prophet, because that's what Jesus is now doing here in chapter 13. You notice he's not walking anywhere, he's not doing a miracle, he's not teaching really, he's being a prophet. And I'm going to use as a point of comparison the prophet Isaiah, a very famous prophet, of course, wonderful book in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. And Isaiah is speaking to the king Hezekiah, king of Judah, around 600 years before the time of Jesus. And when Isaiah speaks to Hezekiah, sometimes the things he's talking about are almost play by play. It's stuff happening that day and the next day, and he's interacting. Sometimes it's things that will happen in the near future, sometime in Hezekiah's lifetime, maybe a year later, a couple of years later. Sometimes Isaiah talks about things that seem a very long way off. So if you read through Isaiah, don't take a break now, but when you in your own study, you'll see, for example, in Isaiah 36:37, it's bam, it's happening right there. It's stuff happening now. And Isaiah is giving the word of the Lord to King Hezekiah about what is happening now and how he should respond to this evil general from the Assyrians. Then you get to parts in the prophecy of Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, and it seems like it's very far away. When Isaiah starts talking about things like the lion laying down with the lamb, well, that doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. It didn't happen in Isaiah's lifetime. In fact, it still hasn't happened in our lifetime. It's something that's yet to come. when Isaiah talks about a new heavens and a new earth, right? Well, that didn't happen in Hezekiah's lifetime. It hasn't happened yet in our lifetime. So the role of a prophet is to speak the word of the Lord, word from God. And sometimes that is about the present, sometimes it's about the near future, and sometimes it's about a very distant future, even about the very end of days. Well, that's what Jesus is doing here in Mark chapter 13. He is giving prophetic word from the Lord, functioning as the ultimate final prophet. And sometimes he's giving teaching about what's presently happening. Sometimes it's about what will happen in the near future, perhaps in their own lifetime. We'll hear about a generation later on. And sometimes it's not yet happened. It's very distant future kind of events. And it's not always clear when a prophet speaks which one is being described at which point. They all kind of jumble together. And the near fulfillment and present happenings might be described in the same frame or same context as a future fulfillment or future prophecies, so that the people that the prophet is addressing can understand both together, right? That God will act in the present and he will act in the future, and his acting in the present is a bit of a foretaste or a foreshadowing of what he will do at the last day. And even if he doesn't deliver the way you want him to in the present, don't forget that in the future there will be this ultimate promise and fulfillment. So again, Jesus is being a prophet here in Mark chapter 13, which requires us to pay very careful attention to the words of the text. There are some, you might say, minor words or less important words that actually give us really important clues as to what Jesus is talking about when. And if you open up your Bibles to Mark 13, just take a quick glance at the chapter headings. So pretty much all modern translations will have a italics or something in between the paragraphs that give a summary of the contents. And I have an ESV Bible, so you see the descriptions there on the screen. Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple, verses 1 and 2. But then in verse 3, it says, signs of the end of the age, or signs of the close of the age. Well, how did that happen? Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple, and then all of a sudden we're on signs of the end of the age. And then, go down. Abomination of desolation, 14. Coming of the Son of Man, 24. Lesson of the fig tree, 28. No one knows the day or the hour, 32. The NIV, I think, is actually a little more helpful here. That only has two chapter headings, signs of the end of the age and the day and the hour unknown. That's actually a little more accurate, as we'll see, because there's actually textual markers. There's words that tell us that that's where a shift happens. So what I'll encourage you to do as we work through this is ignore the chapter headings that you have in your Bible. First of all, because somebody just made them up anyway. Uh, I mean, they're not part of the Bible. They're aids to the reader, and they're not necessarily always accurate. Okay, so what are some of these clues? In verse 8, I'm just going to kind of list some of these out. In verse 8, these things are the beginning of the pains, the birth pains. In verse 14, when you see. Now remember, who's the you? Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, talking to Peter, Andrew, James, and John, looking at the temple. When you see, in those days, plural, there will be an affliction. Verse 24 again, in those days after that affliction, then comes more stuff. Verse 30, this generation will in no way pass away until all these things in the previous 25 verses happen. Then verse 32, we suddenly kind of get a shift concerning that day and hour. Now it's all of a sudden not those days, numerous days, not a general kind of unspecified time span. Rather, now it's a specific day, specific hour, specific moment. And then in verse 32, you do not know when the time is. So notice there's a shift in verse 32 from plural, numerous, long time, unspecified length of days to verse 32 when suddenly it becomes a single day. Now that's a key shift. That's what you see in the chapter headings if you have an NIV translation Bible. And I think that's exactly right because, well, I mean, that's what Jesus says. That's what's in the Bible, right? So again, pay close attention to that shift from plural to singular. And again, think about what Jesus is doing as a prophet. Prophets will speak about the present day, they'll speak about the near future, and they will speak about the distant future. Which time frame is Jesus speaking about in each of these sections? How does this work? Okay. This verse 32 shift is really critical. And I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit here so you can get the overall frame of the chapter. Verse 28, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. Remember fig trees from chapter 11? As soon as this branch, chapter 11. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also you, when you see these things taking place, you know that it is near. We'll get to that in a minute. At the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Notice 30 and preceding is these things, plural. These things, these things, these things. Verse 31, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So verse 31 says, what I am telling you is going to happen. I've already demonstrated that when I say something is going to happen, it happens. And now I'm telling you that all these things I've just described for the last 25 verses will happen. Heaven and earth will go away at some point. We don't know when. But what I'm telling you will not disappear, but it will come true. And then in verse 32, we get the shift concerning that day or that hour, no one knows. What day, what hour is he referring to? He's referring to the day when heaven and earth pass away. So in verses 1 through 31 of chapter 13, we're talking about the stones that they were standing among in verse 1 and 2, and that they're looking at, literally looking at on the Mount of Olives from verse 3 through the end of the chapter. But then in verse 32, after Jesus says heaven and earth will pass away, about that hour, no one knows. And from verse 32 to 37, now Jesus will be talking not about stones, not about buildings, but about the last day when God finally comes to restore his people. So again, Jesus in his role as prophet talks about the present, the near future, and starting in verse 32, the distant future. But prophets are not always easy to understand or interpret. It's only often in hindsight, in retrospect, that you can understand what a prophet was talking about. In fact, that's the only way to know how there's a false prophet, according to the Bible. If what a prophet says will happen doesn't come true, he's a false prophet, and you should stone him, right? But it might be that the prophet dies before we find out that his prophecies don't happen. Here, Jesus says, my prophecy is going to happen. He made these prophecies about 1990 years ago, I guess at this point. And what happened between 30 or so AD and today that connects to what Jesus is talking about in chapter 13 and what is yet to happen that we should be ready for. How does all this fit together? What's the relationship between the present and near future of Jesus' day and the distant future that we have not yet seen? What's that relationship? Well, I'd like to kind of illustrate that in this way. What you're looking at is a photo of Lookout Mountain outside of Denver, actually outside of Golden, Colorado. Beautiful spot. I actually a couple of times have been out there and been able to ride my bike up that mountain. I love cycling, and it's just a beautiful view, and it's a lot of fun to ride your bike all the way up to the top, and then scream all the way down past all the switchbacks, and it's a blast. Anyway, if you've ever driven to Denver, Colorado from the east, uh, you see these mountains just kind of looming, right? And if you look, it looks like this massive thing, and then you don't know what's on the other side. And here you're at Lookout Mountain, and it looks like this gigantic, enormous mountain, but what's on the other side? Well, when you get to the top of Lookout Mountain, it looks like this. You get to the top, and there's mountain after mountain after mountain after mountain after mountain. I've never driven from Denver all the way to the other side. Was it Grand Junction at the other end of the highway there? I've flown to both Denver and Grand Junction, but never driven between the two. But there's a lot in between, a lot of mountains in between, and they're kind of indistinguishable from each other. One sort of looks like another, and they bleed together and seem to go on forever, but they're individual mountains, yet they're all part of the same mountain chain. They're all connected. They're all part of the same geological formation. Well, biblical prophecy is kind of like that view. There are times when a prophet is speaking about a single mountain. And there are times when a prophet seems to be speaking about a bunch of mountains, or maybe a mountain that's a long way off, but it looks an awful lot like a mountain that's very nearby. And it's not always obvious which mountain the prophet is talking about. Is it this one or that one? Is it going to happen tomorrow? Is it going to happen in 2,000 years? That's what the prophet is given by God to see. The prophet might not even be aware in his own brain what's going on. He's speaking by the power of the Lord, by the Spirit. And so his words can be describing things that are very specific or very distant, yet kind of the same thing in some way. We'll see that here in Mark chapter 13, where what Jesus describes is in some cases very specific and very nearby, but in other cases very far away, yet all part of the same event, all part of the same chain, all part of the same activity of God to save his people. So sorry for the kind of longish introduction to all this. But again, when people start talking about the end times, things get a little kind of crazy, and all kinds of predictions, all kinds of this, that, Russia this, Iran that, whatever. Um, uh, let's take the words seriously and understand how the prophet is speaking and how the final greatest prophet, Jesus, is speaking about what is yet to come, both how it relates to the people of his day, even his own life, as we'll see, and those of us who still live today. So again, think of Jesus here as a prophet. Just like Isaiah said things that happened shortly after his lifetime, and we now know that they were fulfilled. There were things that Isaiah talked about that have not yet been fulfilled, that are still future for us. They're past for us, and other things that are future for us. Well, same thing here in Mark chapter 13. Jesus, as the ultimate prophet, is speaking about things that to him and his disciples were still in the future, but maybe not that far away, right? I mean, again, it could happen tomorrow as far as the disciples were concerned. In retrospect, we might be able to see that some of these things have already happened, yet there are some things that are yet to happen that are still in our future. And in some way, they're all connected as part of the same chain, the same activity of God to save his people. Now, the key term related to the last day, the day in verse 32 when heaven and earth will pass away, when Jesus says about that day and that hour, he is using very specific prophetic language, language that the prophets throughout the Old Testament would use about the single day at some point in the distant future, way off in the distance, when God would finally save his people and there would be an end to suffering. So, as you read through the Old Testament, you'll notice, and you should pay very careful attention to, when a prophet will talk about that day. And let me give you one example. There's a whole bunch. You could look at Joel chapter 2. There's Ezekiel does this. Jeremiah, it's all over. But one specific example in Isaiah 13, I'd like to look at kind of carefully because it's parallel to what Jesus is doing in Mark 13. So Isaiah 13, the sound of a tumult is on the mountain, as of a great multitude, the sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. They come from a distant land, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty, it will come. Therefore, all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation, and to destroy the sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Now, that sounds pretty drastic. The Lord Almighty is coming with a host. He's going to make the land a desolation. Sinners will be destroyed. The sun will be dark. The moon will not give its light. That's pretty drastic. And it's all called the day of the Lord. But if you go back to Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1, which I conveniently skipped over, here's what this prophecy is about. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw. So, this prophecy about this day of the Lord and destruction is actually about the kingdom of Babylon, which was threatening Jerusalem at the time of Isaiah, and eventually that kingdom would be overthrown. It would be judged. It would be a terrible day for the Babylonians. And we now know that that, in fact, happened, right? The Persians came in and destroyed the Babylonians, and their kingdom was gone. And they were a massive, incredibly powerful kingdom, but they're gone. And historically, we know that that happened. But in Isaiah's day, when this prophecy was given, it hadn't yet happened. But Isaiah says that day, that near future day for Isaiah, was like the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord, when he would execute judgment on the sinners, as they're called here, and God's people would be saved. And this prophecy is given to Hezekiah and his people as a sign of hope that at some point, these powerful nations that have surrounded you and that threaten you and that tempt you away from worship of God alone, well, they're going to be destroyed. You don't worry about that. God will take care of it on the day of the Lord. At his time, his choosing, God will take care of it. You stay faithful. You trust in God and God alone. Don't go running after other gods. Don't turn to Egypt. Don't turn to other nations. Trust in God. So again, you see Isaiah here talking about a near event, but it sounds kind of like the end of the world. But it's talking about a very specific people, a very specific nation, and a very specific event, which for us happened some 2,500 years ago, right? But for Isaiah, it was still in the, well, relatively near future. That's how prophecy works. That phrase, day of the Lord, is the key phrase. All these events, when God executes judgment on sinners and saves his people, all can be described as the day of the Lord, which is what Jesus does in Mark chapter 13. So, how do you summarize this day of the Lord? Well, a few observations, and this is consistent throughout the Old Testament. It's consistent in Mark chapter 13. First, on the day of the Lord, God comes to rescue his people. It's God's activity. He does it at his time, in his way, and it's not something the people themselves do. The people can't save themselves. God comes to rescue, right? It's a God operation. It's not a self operation. Second, this is never a fun thing. It's terrible. There are wars, there are locusts, there's fire, there's destruction. The sun doesn't shine, the moon doesn't give any light, the star stops shining. It's horrendous what happens when the creator of the heavens and the earth brings judgment. It's not a place you want to be. Judgment happens on individual people. Third bullet. Well, actually, judgment happens. Whether it's good or bad depends. Those who are faithful are saved. Those who are faithless will be destroyed. So there's only two categories of people, right? Those who trust in God and those who don't. Those who are faithful and those who are faithless. And the day of the Lord, when the prophets speak, is a reminder to God's people to stay faithful. Even when it seems bleak, even when it seems things will not work out, God is faithful, and on that day, you will be saved. But for others, it's not a good thing. Fourth point, there's finality to that day. Something ends and something begins. The old goes away and something new arises in its place. With the judgment and the rescue comes a new order, a new way of being in the world, a new way of life for God's people, no longer threatened by those enemies. So there's an ending. It's a terrible ending, but there's also a new life that comes for those who are faithful. And last point, just to reemphasize, this is always God's action. This is always God's action. The people can't save themselves. Hezekiah in Isaiah's day couldn't save himself. The disciples couldn't save themselves. We can't save ourselves, right? It's God's action. He is the only one who can bring about deliverance, as well as the only one who can bring about judgment. So, this Day of the Lord theme is a very important theme throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Hebrew Bible. We see it in the Gospels. Jesus refers to it several times. We also see it in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul talks about the day. We see it in 1 Corinthians 15. We see it in Philippians chapter 1. It's a common motif, a common theme that's reflective of the confidence of the apostles and the prophets speaking God's word to encourage people to find their hope in God, in God's action, and not in themselves. So that's where Jesus is turning his disciples, right? Remember, they're saying, "Hey, Jesus, look at the Empire State Building. Isn't that really cool?" And Jesus says, "Yeah, not really, because those stones, like all the stones that came before and all the stones that people have built later on, all that will go away. But God will stay faithful." So Jesus is, just like Isaiah did with Hezekiah, Jesus is turning his disciples' attentions away from what humans are doing and onto what God is doing, right? Don't trust in princes, trust in God, because he will come, he will save his people. That's where to place your confidence and hope. So, day of the Lord, day of the Lord. Oh, so just again to show how this is reflected in Mark chapter 13 with this mountaintop idea, where you have a single mountain, but in a range of mountains, all of which kind of look the same. For the first 30 verses, you're going to see mountain, 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 and they all kind of look the same. These things, those days, these things, this generation. It's kind of this smattering of mountaintops, some of which are closer, some of which are further away. All these things are happening in the first 30 verses. All of these is what's being prophesied in the first 30 verses. But then you get to verse 32. Well, 31. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And concerning that day, right, single day. Now we're talking day of the Lord, the one ultimate day. Or verse 32 or 34. You do not know when that time is. So, near fulfillment, looks similar, sounds similar, yet all pointing to that single ultimate day when God comes to save his people. Here's our outline then of chapter 13. Jesus is pretty specific as he walks through this. Of course, we saw verses 1 and 2. They're at the temple. We're still on Tuesday of Holy Week. In 2 through 4, we get the questions on the Mount of Olives. Sorry, that's verses 3 and 4, not 2 through 4. They're on the Mount of Olives, and Peter, James, Andrew, and John ask Jesus the question, when is this going to happen? Again, because they're learning that when Jesus says something is going to happen, it's going to happen. The only question is when. They're rightfully afraid. In verses 5 through 8, we get the beginning of these things, and it's kind of worldwide. It's kind of this general description of things happening. We'll see this in a minute here. In verses 9 through 13, he talks about the church, the followers of Jesus suffering, a theme that we saw a few times in Mark's gospel, and in 8, 9, 10, we saw in the first session. In 14 to 23, it's not so much worldwide and global, and it's not even really the church, individual people. Now it's specifically a place, and he talks about what's going to happen in Judea, what's going to happen in this place. As we'll see, very specific references that give us clues as to what Jesus is talking about there. In 24 to 27, it kind of expands back out to this global theme, and it looks very dramatic, very similar to the language in Isaiah about the sun darkening, the moon not giving its light. It's this kind of terrible vision of things happening, which is not the first time that kind of language is used in the Bible. In verses 28 to 30, Jesus kind of gives the disciples this warning. This generation will see all these things. And that's a very specific prophetic statement. This generation will see all these things. I mean, take that seriously, right? In verse, let me read it again, verse uh, 30. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So a generation in a biblical framework is 40 years, right? Remember the children of Israel when they were in the wilderness and they would not trust Moses and trust God that they could enter the promised land and conquer the giants that the spies had saw. Uh, God said, okay, this generation will die. Everyone in this generation will pass away. 40 years. And then another leader, not Moses, will take them into the promised land. So this generation is a very specific length of time in the Bible. It's 40 years. Jesus is speaking in, 30, 31, somewhere in that ballpark. There's a couple ways you could date that. We'll get into that in the future here. But Jesus is putting a remarkably precise expiration date on his prophecy. This generation, Jesus, the people he's looking at, will not pass away until all these things take place. Is it going to happen? Of course, now we're living, almost 2,000 years later. We can look back and ask, did it actually happen? When Jesus said it was going to happen, did it happen? As we'll see, it has, right? Hold on a second. And then 31, heaven and earth will pass away. And as we saw, the transition of verse 32 to talk about the day of the Lord. So we're setting up then, walking through each of these sections and seeing how they relate to the near fulfillment and the distant final fulfillment of what Jesus had said would happen. And the theme that we're driving to is when Jesus says something is going to happen, what happens? And this chapter serves as a warning, to stay faithful, as he says at the end in verse 37, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. But, as we'll get into the details next week, it's also a promise. Because when Jesus says it's going to happen, it will happen. When he says that God will deliver his people by his grace and mercy, it happens. When he says that even though everyone falls away, I will keep my word, it happens. So next week, next session, we'll get into the details of how this passage shows that Jesus keeps his word, that what Jesus says will happen, happens, and how that fulfillment in Mark chapter 13, this prophecy in Mark chapter 13, has both elements that have already happened, they're historical fact now, and there are things that are yet to come. There are things that, even in our day, 2,000 years later, still look like a distant mountaintop. Yet God is faithful to his promises, and he has promised to rescue his people. And so next week, we'll see how Jesus says that will happen. Thanks. Look forward to talking with you again. Take care.